China, 1949. The crisp morning air over Tiananmen Square was thick with anticipation. A crowd of tens of thousands gathered, their eyes fixed on a man who had risen from the countryside to reshape the destiny of an entire nation. Mao Zedong, at 55, stepped onto the rostrum and proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China. The streets of Beijing, once marked by decades of foreign invasion, civil war, and internal chaos, now echoed with revolutionary fervor. For Mao and the Communist Party, this was not just a political victory, it was the culmination of decades of struggle, suffering, and vision. Mao's regime presented itself as a people's democratic dictatorship, yet in reality, democracy was a hollow promise. Power was concentrated at the top, the Central Committee of around 100 senior party members, the 12-member Politburo, and within it, the Standing Committee, where real authority resided. Among its 5 most prominent figures stood Liu Shaoqi, a seasoned labor organizer who had studied in Moscow and now served as the party's vice chairman. Zhou Enlai, the charismatic revolutionary hero and future first premier, who balanced diplomacy with unwavering loyalty to Mao. And Mao himself, the ultimate arbiter of China's fate. Mao was no natural orator, yet he captivated crowds with his intellect, strategic insight, and the sheer magnetism of his persona. His journey to this point had been marked by tireless struggle, fighting Japanese invaders, enduring internal party conflicts, and outmaneuvering the nationalists. By now, he commanded unquestioned authority, and with his fourth wife, Jiang Qing'a, formidable, ambitious, and politically ruthless partner, he wielded personal and political influence with precision. Jiang Qing would become an inseparable force, shaping propaganda and defending Mao against rivals, real or imagined. The nation Mao inherited was battered and impoverished. After years of invasion, occupation, and civil war, China remained overwhelmingly rural. Roughly 80% of its population were peasants, living on small plots of land, barely surviving, and shaped by centuries of feudal hierarchies. Yet these peasants were also the bedrock of the communist revolution, drawn by promises of land redistribution and equality. From the outset, Mao's government moved swiftly to impose its vision, heavily influenced by Soviet models. Approximately 10,000 Soviet advisors arrived to assist with economic planning, industrialization, and modernization. Their expertise was essential, for China lacked the infrastructure, industry, and administrative capacity to rebuild itself overnight. The Communists' first mission was to transform the countryside, the heart of China, where, centuries old, social structures needed dismantling to make way for revolutionary change. Land reform became the party's immediate tool of transformation. Landlords, long entrenched as village elites, were publicly humiliated, tried, and often executed. Over 1 million people perished in this campaign, while roughly 300 million peasants gained ownership of land for the first time in their lives. This radical redistribution wasn't merely economic, it was ideological, reshaping centuries of social hierarchy and cementing the Communist Party as the defender of the common people. Simultaneously, the government introduced reforms to improve women's rights, literacy campaigns, and public education, while simplified Chinese characters were promoted to accelerate literacy in a largely illiterate society. Propaganda became the lifeblood of the new regime. Posters, public performances, and storytelling in village squares spread revolutionary ideology, educating and indoctrinating simultaneously. Those deemed counter-revolutionary supporters of the nationalists, corrupt officials, and capitalists faced denunciation, imprisonment, or death. Traditional elites were stripped of wealth, status, and even life. Across cities and villages, families were torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and countless lives lost. It was a society undergoing metamorphosis, propelled by ideology and enforced with ruthless discipline. As China looked outward, the geopolitical reality was stark. The world was dividing into 2 ideological blocs: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, dominated by the Soviet Union. Western powers, wary of Mao's rise, continued to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan as China's legitimate authority. Isolated and vulnerable, Mao sought strategic alignment with Stalin's Soviet Union. In December 1949, he traveled to Moscow for a tense 3-month negotiation, resulting in the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. In February 1950, a partnership that would shape China's economic and military strategies in the years ahead, even if ideological tensions simmered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Mao's government acted to consolidate territorial control. Xinjiang was reclaimed by the People's Liberation Army, Tibet annexed in 1951 under the banner of peaceful liberation, and Outer Mongolia remained outside Chinese control, now under Soviet influence. Taiwan persisted as a contentious symbol of unresolved civil war. Mao's China was taking shape, politically centralized, socially transformed, and territorially reasserted, but the challenges ahead would test the nation's resilience. The stage was set. A new China had emerged from decades of chaos. One man's vision, combined with the discipline and sacrifice of millions, would now confront the enormous task of rebuilding a vast, fractured society. For Mao, this was just the beginning. The victories were real, but the trials would be monumental, and the price human and social would be staggering. The world watched, uncertain whether this new China would flourish or falter under the weight of ambition and idealism. The revolution did not end with the proclamation of a new state. It moved swiftly into the villages, the heart of China, where the majority of its people lived and worked. For centuries, the rural population had been bound to the land under a rigid hierarchy. Landlords, often untouchable elites, held power over peasants through debt, tradition, and brute force. Now, under the banner of the Communist Party, these centuries-old structures were being violently uprooted. Land reform became the engine of this transformation. Villages were swept into a whirlwind of political campaigns. Meetings were held in village squares where peasants were encouraged or forced to denounce the landlords who had long dominated their lives. Accusations flew, sometimes accurate, sometimes fabricated, but the consequences were terrifyingly real. Public trials often ended in execution, while others faced imprisonment or forced labor. Over 1 million landlords and perceived enemies of the revolution were killed during this campaign, a grim testament to the cost of change. Meanwhile, roughly 300 million peasants gained ownership of land, many for the first time in their lives. The redistribution was not merely economic, it was deeply symbolic, a tangible promise that the revolution was on their side. For the peasants, the reforms were life-altering. Families who had lived in fear for generations now worked their own plots, free from the yoke of landlord control. Yet this freedom came with intense political indoctrination. Party cadres ensured that peasants were not just landowners, but loyal citizens, immersed in the ideals of socialism and the cult of mass. Propaganda campaigns flooded the countryside. Songs, plays, posters, and public storytelling reinforced the narrative of liberation, class struggle, and the moral righteousness of the communist cause. Women, long marginalized in traditional rural society, found new opportunities and protections under the reforms. Land reform laws guaranteed women the right to inherit property and participate in labor. Education programs, aimed at increasing literacy rates, included girls as well as boys. Simplified Chinese characters were introduced to make reading and writing more accessible to a largely illiterate population. These initiatives were revolutionary not just in scope, but in their challenge to entrenched patriarchal norms. Yet the reforms were not without chaos. Villages were transformed almost overnight. Peasants had to navigate new social hierarchies, unfamiliar communal responsibilities, and an ever-watchful party presence. Happiness and liberation were sometimes measured in fear. Public humiliations. Those suspected of anti-revolutionary sentiments supporters of the nationalists. Wealthy peasants, or merely skeptics, could find themselves stripped of land, wealth, and dignity, or even executed. Entire families were uprooted, property confiscated, and villages reshaped according to party dictates. The pace and intensity of reform were unprecedented. Within a few years, the Chinese countryside had been radically altered. Local governance, once dominated by landlords or traditional elders, was replaced by party committees. Communal granaries, collective farming systems, and cooperative labor groups began to take shape. Peasants were now organized not as individual households but as collective units, their lives increasingly entwined with the goals and mandates of the Communist Party. The psychological and social impact of this transformation was immense. A peasant who had once been powerless could now feel the intoxicating surge of agency. But alongside it came the weight of surveillance, obligation, and ideological conformity. Daily life, from farming to festivals, was now closely intertwined with political campaigns. Personal ambition and private enterprise were discouraged. The collective good was the highest law. As the land reforms reshaped China, the government turned its eyes to the outside world. Diplomatic recognition remained scarce. The United States and its allies continued to acknowledge Chiang Kai-shek as nationalist regime in Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. Surrounded by skepticism and hostility, Mao sought allies in the Soviet Union. His journey to Moscow in late 1949 and the subsequent signing of the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance with Stalin in February 1950 marked a crucial turning point. Soviet aid would flow into industry, agriculture, and military development, but the ideological relationship was fraught with tension. Mao's vision of a uniquely Chinese socialism would soon collide with Soviet orthodoxy. Back home, the momentum of reform set the stage for even more ambitious projects. Land reform had shown that the Communist Party could reshape society, but Mao's vision extended beyond redistribution. He wanted to transform China into a modern socialist state, capable of matching the industrial power of the West. The seeds of what would later become the Great Leap Forward were being sown, even as the nation was still healing from decades of war, famine, and upheaval. By the mid-1950s, the vast majority of Chinese peasants were organized into cooperatives, These were not merely economic units, they were ideological laboratories. The party sought to control not only how people worked, but how they thought, ate, and lived. Private property was shrinking. Communal life expanded. Kitchens, schools, and social spaces were centralized. The family unit became secondary to the collective. The transformation was both physical and mental, as centuries of rural tradition collided with revolutionary ambition. Land reform was a double-edged sword. It brought freedom and ownership to millions. Yet it also introduced fear, coercion, and a relentless pressure to conform. For many peasants, life had changed irreversibly. Their future was now inseparable from the Communist Party's vision. The revolution had succeeded in uprooting old hierarchies. But the social experiments it unleashed were only beginning, and the consequences, both intended and catastrophic, were yet to be fully realized. As land reform transformed the countryside, the Communist Party turned its gaze toward consolidating power across the nation. The new regime, while revolutionary, faced innumerable threats, real or perceived. Those who had once wielded authority, from former nationalist officials to wealthy capitalists, were now considered dangerous to the fragile state. Mao and his inner circle knew that ideological loyalty was not merely desirable, it was essential. The survival of the revolution depended on it. The campaign against counter-revolutionaries began almost immediately. Party cadres scoured towns and cities, identifying individuals suspected of undermining socialist construction. These were often people with ties to the former Kuomintang government officials, business owners, or anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to the communist cause. The net, however, was far from precise. Innocent citizens, neighbors with grudges, or even peasants, fearful of being labeled as sympathizers, could find themselves accused. Sometimes anonymously, sometimes through orchestrated trials were swift, often theatrical, conducted in public squares where accusations were read aloud, and confessions real or coerced were demanded. Punishments ranged from public humiliation and forced labor to execution. Entire families could be targeted, creating a climate of fear that permeated the streets and villages alike. Party propaganda reinforced the necessity of these actions, portraying them as moral purges, cleansing society of corruption, and ensuring the loyalty of the citizenry. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands lost their lives, while millions more suffered imprisonment, confiscation of property, or social ostracism. In cities, the campaign was particularly brutal. Intellectuals, educators, and scientists were pressured to conform or face ruin. Universities became arenas of ideological scrutiny, where students were encouraged to report on professors' counter-revolutionary tendencies. Businesses were nationalized, and entrepreneurs often disappeared or were publicly shamed. The state sought to eradicate any trace of private capitalism, asserting control over all production, commerce, and distribution. In this new reality, wealth and social standing offered no protection. Only party loyalty ensured survival. The psychological impact was profound. Fear became a constant companion, shaping interactions at home, in neighborhoods, and workplaces. People learned to self-censor, to suppress doubts, and to conform outwardly, even when inner convictions conflicted with party doctrine. Society itself became a tool of surveillance. Peers observed each other, communities policed themselves, and a culture of denunciation emerged. Trust was fragile. Loyalty was performative. Dissent could mean death. Mao's leadership during this period was paradoxical. He appeared both omnipotent and distant, a figure whose presence was felt everywhere, yet seen rarely. His speeches, written directives, and public appearances were designed to instill awe and obedience. Yet behind the scenes, policy decisions were often experimental, improvisational, and reliant on local officials to implement them, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. This gap between central vision and local execution would later contribute to disasters such as the Great Leap Forward. But at this stage, it allowed Mao to maintain tight ideological control. While projecting an image of unshakable authority, the suppression of counter-revolutionaries also served a symbolic purpose. It was a declaration that the old order, with its feudal hierarchies, capitalist enterprises, and political rivals, was permanently over. Public executions and forced confessions were not merely punitive, they were performative rituals of transformation. Citizens were witnessing the tangible collapse of the past, a violent reordering of social and political life that left no ambiguity about who held power. The campaign, however, was not just repressive, it was instructive. The Communist Party used it as a tool for political education, turning trials and denunciations into lessons in morality, class consciousness, and loyalty. The populace was bombarded with narratives that framed punishment as justice, that framed suffering as necessary for the collective good. Children grew up learning that the state's word was absolute, and that ideological purity was the highest form of virtue. Foreign relations during this period added another layer of tension. Western nations continued to refuse recognition, isolating the People's Republic of China diplomatically and economically. The United States, in particular, maintained support for Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime in Taiwan, positioning itself as an adversary of the new government. The threat of external hostility reinforced the internal crackdown. The leadership argued that vigilance against counter-revolutionaries was essential not only for domestic stability, but for the survival of China itself against foreign imperialism. This climate of fear, control, and ideological rigor was foundational to the communist state. It instilled obedience and conformity, ensuring that the party's authority was unchallenged. Yet the human cost was staggering. Families were torn apart, communities disrupted, and millions of lives were irrevocably altered. The suppression of counter-revolutionaries became both a means of consolidating power and a blueprint for the political culture that would dominate China for decades, one where dissent was dangerous, loyalty was enforced, and the state demanded absolute submission. By the late 1950s, this strategy of control had created a tightly bound society ready for even more ambitious transformations. The same mechanisms that had allowed the party to identify, punish, and re-educate counter-revolutionaries would now be turned toward the countryside and industry, shaping the trajectory of programs like the First Five-Year Plan and, eventually, the Great Leap Forward. The foundation had been laid. A population conditioned to obedience, a government capable of vast social engineering, and a leader whose vision, however grandiose, would be implemented with relentless, often ruthless, efficiency. While Mao and his party consolidated power within China, the Young People's Republic faced a daunting international landscape. The aftermath of World War II had left the globe divided, and the emerging Cold War drew sharp lines between two ideological blocs: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, dominated by the Soviet Union. China's new leadership, still fragile and economically weakened, found itself largely isolated. Western nations refused to recognize the communist government in Beijing, instead maintaining diplomatic ties with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime, now entrenched in Taiwan. For the communist leadership, the West was not just skeptical, it was an active threat. Mao's solution was pragmatic: turn to the Soviet Union, the only superpower willing to embrace and support a communist China. In December 1949, Mao traveled to Moscow to negotiate directly with Joseph Stalin. The talks were complex and tense, reflecting the balance of mutual need and mutual suspicion. The Soviets offered technical expertise, economic aid, and military guidance, but they also expected compliance with certain ideological lines, particularly in industrial planning and governance. Mao, determined to assert China's independence, navigated the negotiations with careful calculation, striving to secure aid without relinquishing sovereignty. By February 1950, the negotiations bore fruit. The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was signed. The treaty cemented a formal alliance that would shape China's domestic and foreign policy for years to come. Economically, it provided China with vital technical advisors, machinery, and funding to launch ambitious industrialization projects. Militarily, it guaranteed Soviet support if China faced aggression from external powers, particularly the United States. Ideologically, the treaty aligned China firmly within the communist camp, yet Mao remained acutely aware of the limits of Soviet guidance. Determined to chart a distinct path that reflected Chinese conditions rather than blindly copying Moscow, the alliance with the Soviet Union had deeper strategic implications. Beyond securing material aid, it provided legitimacy on the world stage. For the West, China's partnership with Moscow confirmed the expansion of the communist bloc in Asia, intensifying Cold War tensions. For China, the treaty was a buffer against external threats, a signal that any intervention by the United States or its allies would meet not just Chinese resistance, but potentially Soviet support as well. This calculated positioning allowed Mao to focus on internal consolidation, confident that the threat of foreign intervention could be mitigated. Yet even as relations flourished publicly, fissures were emerging beneath the surface. Mao's vision for China was not identical to Stalin's vision for the Soviet Union. Differences in economic priorities, national pride, and interpretations of Marxist ideology would later sow distrust and ideological divergence. Mao, who had witnessed the devastation of imperialist wars and foreign domination, was fiercely protective of China's sovereignty. Any suggestion that China should follow the Soviet model unquestioningly was met with suspicion and resistance. While the treaty represented an era of cooperation, it also planted the seeds for future rivalry. As Chinese leaders increasingly sought to assert independence from Moscow's shadow, the international context further complicated China's domestic policies. The Korean Peninsula, just across China's northeastern border, became a flashpoint that would test the limits of the Sino-Soviet alliance and China's military capabilities. In June 1950, North Korea invaded the South, triggering a rapid international response. The United Nations, under the leadership of the United States, intervened to support South Korea, pushing the North Korean army back to the Yalu River, perilously close to China. Mao faced a critical decision: remain passive and risk a hostile US-backed state on China's border, or intervene militarily to protect national security and communist interests. Relying on the strategic support promised in the Soviet treaty, Mao committed Chinese forces into the conflict. Over 1 million troops eventually crossed into Korea, eventually numbering around 2.5 million. The Chinese intervention shocked the world, pushing UN forces southward and transforming the conflict into a grueling stalemate along the 38th parallel. From Beijing's perspective, the intervention was a victory, signaling that China could defend its borders, protect its ideology, and assert itself on the global stage even against the world's most powerful military. The cost, however, was immense. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were killed or wounded, including Mao's own son, Mao Anying, in a UN airstrike. The Korean War demonstrated the practical value of the Sino-Soviet alliance while also testing its limits. China had relied on Soviet technical and logistical support, but also learned the importance of self-reliance. The conflict reinforced a growing narrative within the Chinese leadership. To secure its future, China could not depend entirely on foreign powers, even allies. This realization would later influence economic and military policies. Pushing for greater domestic innovation and autonomy in the realm of diplomacy, the alliance also shaped China's perception of the wider world. The hostility of the West, coupled with the ideological support of the Soviet Union, cemented a worldview in which China was both embattled and empowered. The party framed international challenges as evidence of imperialist aggression, justifying tight domestic control and emphasizing the need for unity. Propaganda depicted China's alliance with Moscow as a triumph of ideology, while the Korean War became a narrative of patriotic defense and global solidarity against capitalist encroachment. By the mid-1950s, the foundation was laid for China's first major industrial campaigns. Soviet engineers and advisors poured into Chinese factories and construction projects, guiding the establishment of steel mills, power plants, and infrastructure networks. The Sino-Soviet relationship enabled China to leapfrog certain technological stages, adopting methods and machinery that would have otherwise taken decades to develop domestically. Yet as ambitious projects rolled forward, underlying tensions with Moscow persisted, foreshadowing the ideological and strategic split that would emerge in the late 1950s. Ultimately, the early Sino-Soviet alliance was a double-edged sword. It provided essential resources, expertise, and a measure of international legitimacy. But it also challenged Chinese leaders to assert independence within the communist bloc, shaping a political culture that prized self-reliance, ideological rigor, and national sovereignty. These early decisions in international relations not only protected the fledgling state, but also set the stage for the grand ambitions and domestic experiments, sometimes catastrophic, that would define the next decade under Mao's leadership. While Mao focused on consolidating power internally and nurturing the Sino-Soviet alliance, the young People's Republic of China faced a pressing challenge closer to home: territorial integrity. Centuries of imperial expansion under the Qing dynasty had left China with vast, diverse regions, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia, that were only loosely controlled. After the fall of the Qing and the chaos of the Republican era, many of these frontier areas had drifted toward autonomy or foreign influence. For the communist government, reclaiming control was both a matter of national pride and strategic necessity. Xinjiang, in the far northwest, had long been a mosaic of ethnic groups, including Uyghurs, Cossacks, and other Turkic peoples. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party dispatched the People's Liberation Army to assert authority over the region. The military campaign was swift and largely effective, aided by the fragmented political situation and local factions willing to cooperate with Beijing. By the end of that year, Xinjiang was under central government control, symbolizing the first major step in reasserting the authority of a unified China over its peripheries. In Tibet, the process was more complex. The region had been effectively autonomous, with the Dalai Lama serving as both spiritual and political leader. In 1950, under the guise of a peaceful liberation, Chinese forces entered Tibet. Although initial resistance was limited, the occupation culminated in the 1951 17-point agreement, which nominally preserved the Dalai Lama's authority over local affairs while recognizing Chinese sovereignty. For Mao, Tibet was not just a territorial issue but a test of how far the government could project its power into regions steeped in cultural and religious distinctiveness. While the PLA maintained order, underlying tensions simmered, foreshadowing future unrest. Outer Mongolia, now simply Mongolia, remained outside Beijing's direct control. During the chaos of the Republican era and Soviet influence, it had moved toward independence under Soviet protection. Mao, mindful of the strategic balance with the USSR, chose not to contest Mongolia directly, preferring to focus on territories within easier reach and with less risk of provoking a superpower. The decision reflected a nuanced understanding of geopolitical realities. showing that consolidation of China's peripheries required both force and diplomacy. The campaign to unify China's borders was more than a military or political effort. It was also deeply symbolic. These regions represented the historical breadth of China and the possibility of a fully integrated nation-state. Their incorporation reinforced the narrative of a resurgent China reclaiming its rightful place on the global stage, echoing the nationalist pride that had driven earlier leaders. At the same time, the methods used military pressure, negotiated agreements, and strategic patience set patterns for how the Communist Party would handle ethnic and regional challenges in the decades to come. Territorial consolidation also had domestic repercussions. Bringing these frontier regions under central control allowed the government to extend communist policies, land reform, social restructuring, and political indoctrination into areas that had previously been autonomous. For example, Tibet's integration facilitated later campaigns to reorganize land ownership and implement socialist-style reforms, although such efforts would encounter resistance and cultural friction. Similarly, Xinjiang became a testing ground for how the party could manage ethnically diverse populations while asserting political authority. Beyond the immediate borders, territorial consolidation sent a powerful message to both allies and adversaries. The Western Bloc, already wary of the communist regime, recognized China's growing capacity to assert sovereignty over contested areas. The Korean War, which erupted shortly after these territorial moves, would soon further demonstrate China's willingness to defend its borders and ideological interests with military force. In this sense, consolidating China's peripheries was not only about domestic stability, but also about establishing credibility and deterrence in a volatile international environment. By 1951, Mao could point to a China that, at least on paper, had regained control over most of its historic territories. Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia were integrated under central authority, setting a stage for ambitious social and economic transformations. Yet the process left unresolved tensions. Ethnic identities, local customs, and religious practices clashed with the Communist Party's vision of uniform governance. These challenges would persist, simmering beneath the surface and occasionally erupting in rebellion or protest. Mao's consolidation was impressive in scope, but also carried the seeds of future conflict both within China and in its relations with neighboring states. The campaign demonstrated the dual nature of communist strategy, combining military might with political negotiation, ideology with pragmatism, and domestic objectives with international considerations. It reflected Mao's broader approach to leadership: assertive, uncompromising where necessary, yet calculated in recognizing limits imposed by geography, culture, and global politics. Territorial consolidation thus marked a critical chapter in the People's Republic's early years, shaping both the physical map of modern China and the political patterns that would define Mao's rule for decades. As the People's Republic of China was still consolidating its territories and implementing domestic reforms, a new crisis erupted on its northeastern border that would soon engulf the nation in an international conflict. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, invading the south in a lightning offensive that captured Seoul within days. The Korean peninsula, divided after World War II into a communist north and a capitalist south, became a flashpoint of the emerging Cold War. For Mao and the Communist Party, the invasion posed both a threat and an opportunity. A threat because of the proximity of U.S.-led forces to China's borders, and an opportunity to assert China's role as a protector of global socialism. The United States, responding under the banner of the United Nations, quickly deployed troops to assist South Korea. By late 1950, UN forces had advanced perilously close to the Yalu River, the natural boundary with China. Alarmed by the prospect of a hostile military presence directly on Chinese soil and determined to defend its new regime, Mao made the fateful decision to intervene. He mobilized the People's Liberation Army, sending over 1 million troops into North Korea. This contingent would soon swell to approximately 2.5 million, a staggering commitment for a nation still recovering from decades of war and famine. The Chinese forces, often under-equipped and facing harsh winter conditions, engaged in fierce battles with UN troops, pushing them back from the Yalu and halting their advance. These engagements, brutal and exhausting, showcased the determination and resilience of the PLA, even against technologically superior opponents. Mao's intervention turned the tide of the war, stabilizing the front and ensuring that North Korea would survive as a communist state. In doing so, China sent a powerful signal to the world: it was willing to defend its ideological allies and its borders at great human and material cost. The human toll of the Korean War was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that some 3 million lives were lost, including over 500,000 Chinese soldiers. Among them was Mao's own son, Mao Anying, killed in a UN airstrike, a personal tragedy that underscored the war's devastating reach. Despite the staggering losses, the outcome strengthened the legitimacy of the Communist Party in the eyes of the Chinese populace. Mao had successfully projected China's military might beyond its borders and had shown that the newly established PRC could stand against the world's most powerful military. The war also shaped China's strategic outlook. U.S. economic sanctions and a continued arms embargo against China reinforced the perception of the nation as encircled by hostile forces. Meanwhile, the war cemented the division of the Korean peninsula, creating a tense and heavily militarized boundary along the 38th parallel that would persist for decades. Domestically, the conflict validated the party's narrative of defending socialism against capitalist aggression and helped justify extensive military and political mobilization within China. Korean War veterans returned to a nation eager for reconstruction but hardened by conflict. The experiences of the war reinforced the need for centralized control, ideological unity, and a strong military presence to defend both internal stability and national sovereignty. It also influenced subsequent policies, including industrialization programs and agricultural campaigns, as the leadership sought to build a China capable of resisting external pressures without relying excessively on foreign powers. By 1953, after 3 years of bloody stalemate, an armistice was signed, establishing the Demilitarized Zone (DMZ) along the 38th parallel. While technically only a ceasefire, the armistice represented a strategic victory for China. Mao and his generals could claim they had successfully defended a neighboring communist state against the United States, solidifying China's emerging identity as a global actor and protector of socialist ideology. The war bolstered national pride, strengthened the Communist Party's domestic authority, and served as a stark reminder of the costs of global power struggles in the early Cold War era. The Korean War also underscored the limits and consequences of ideological ambition. While China had asserted its military capability, it had done so at enormous cost. The massive casualties, economic strain, and social disruption highlighted the fragile balance between aspiration and reality. Mao's leadership, though solidified by this show of resolve, was tempered by the awareness that the nation's resources and population had been heavily taxed, a lesson that would resonate in the coming years, especially during campaigns like the Great Leap Forward. Ultimately, the Korean War marked a defining moment for China. It was a baptism by fire for the newly established communist state, testing its military, political, and social resilience. It demonstrated the PRC's willingness to intervene internationally to protect its interests and allies, while simultaneously shaping domestic priorities and reinforcing the party's narrative of heroic struggle. The conflict left scars that would influence policy, governance, and the psyche of the Chinese people for generations, a stark reminder that the defense of ideology and territory often comes at a price that no nation can escape. Fresh from the Korean War and armed with heightened national pride, China turned its attention inward, embarking on a transformative journey to modernize its economy. In 1953, the Communist Party launched the first five-year plan, a sweeping program inspired by Soviet models of industrialization. The objective was nothing short of revolutionary: to elevate China from a predominantly agrarian society into a modern, industrialized socialist state capable of rivaling the world's great powers. The plan emphasized heavy industry: steel, coal, machinery, and energy infrastructure. Soviet advisors arrived in droves, providing technical expertise, blueprints, and guidance for building factories, railways, and power plants. Cities like Anshan, Wuhan, and Shenyang became centers of rapid industrial expansion, with new plants sprouting amid a landscape still scarred by years of war and neglect. The Chinese leadership pushed workers to meet ambitious production quotas, fostering a culture of collective effort and patriotic zeal. By the mid-1950s, the plan's achievements were evident. Production of coal, steel, and electricity surpassed initial targets, laying the foundations for a self-sufficient industrial base. The transportation network expanded, connecting urban factories with rural supply chains and enabling the movement of people and goods on an unprecedented scale. Oil production increased, signaling the country's emergence as a strategic energy player. These successes gave Mao and his inner circle confidence that China could rapidly transform its economy and society if only the momentum could be sustained. Simultaneously, the government sought to revolutionize agriculture. The first five-year plan encouraged farmers to participate in collective farming, forming cooperatives that pooled land, tools, and labor. By 1956, about 80% of peasant households had joined cooperatives, a dramatic social transformation that altered rural life. Beyond improving efficiency, collectivization aimed to consolidate party control over villages, ensuring that communist ideology penetrated even the most remote corners of the countryside. These agricultural reforms carried dual objectives: economic productivity, and political consolidation. While pooling resources allowed for larger-scale farming and mechanization, it also diminished the influence of traditional village elites and disrupted centuries-old social structures. Families who had tilled their land for generations were now part of collective units, their daily routines, meals, and harvests overseen by party-appointed officials. Local customs were reshaped, and individual initiative was increasingly subordinated to collective goals. The cultural and social impact was profound. Women gained a stronger role in the workforce and within the cooperatives, reflecting communist commitments to gender equality. Literacy campaigns expanded, leveraging the simplification of Chinese characters to educate millions of previously illiterate citizens. Propaganda campaigns, through theater, public storytelling, and posters, instilled revolutionary values and a vision of a modern China united under socialist principles. Citizens were not just working the land or operating factories, they were participating in a national project, a narrative carefully cultivated by the party to inspire loyalty and obedience. Yet the plan was not without its challenges. Rapid industrial expansion strained resources, and the integration of Soviet expertise sometimes clashed with local conditions and traditional knowledge. In agriculture, collectivization caused tension as peasants adjusted to the loss of private landholdings and familiar routines. Despite these obstacles, the early years of the five-year plan were largely hailed as a success. Mao viewed this period as proof that the Communist Party could orchestrate large-scale social engineering and economic transformation. Setting the stage for even more ambitious undertakings in the coming decade, the first five-year plan left an enduring legacy. It solidified the central role of the state in economic planning, demonstrated the effectiveness of mobilizing mass labor for national objectives, and laid the groundwork for China's industrial base. More importantly, it reinforced the party's narrative that rapid modernization, when guided by socialist ideology, could achieve remarkable results. But beneath the triumphs lay a growing tension between ambition and practicality, a tension that would erupt in the later, far more catastrophic campaigns of the Great Leap Forward. By 1956, China had begun to change fundamentally. Cities hummed with industrial activity, rural landscapes were dotted with collective farms, and millions of citizens were engaged in a shared vision of national transformation. The first five-year plan had succeeded in demonstrating what the Communist Party could achieve when ideology, authority, and mass mobilization converged. It was a period of promise, energy, and immense social experimentation, but also one that hinted at the enormous challenges and human costs that would accompany China's next bold leap. By the mid-1950s, the Communist Party had consolidated power across urban and rural China, establishing control over the economy, education, and social institutions. Yet Mo Tuoshang remained acutely aware of the challenges of governing a vast, diverse nation with millions of educated citizens who were capable of independent thought. In 1956, he launched what would become known as the 100 Flowers Campaign, an initiative that appeared, on the surface, to encourage free expression and open debate. The slogan, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend," promised intellectuals, scholars, and ordinary citizens a platform to voice constructive criticism of the government. Universities, literary circles, and even local community meetings became arenas for discussion, with essays, speeches, and letters submitted in abundance. At first, the party leadership welcomed these critiques as a way to identify shortcomings and strengthen governance. However, the response from the population was far more fervent and unrestrained than anticipated. Intellectuals and professionals openly criticized party policies, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and even Mao's personal leadership. They exposed corruption, highlighted mismanagement, and questioned the pace and methods of collectivization. Far from the cautious feedback the party expected, the criticisms were sharp, bold, and widespread. Mao and the leadership quickly grew alarmed. What had been intended as a controlled experiment in dialogue had morphed into a wave of dissent that threatened the party's authority. The movement revealed underlying frustrations that had been simmering for years, grievances from academics, rural elites, and urban professionals, whose expertise and voices had been marginalized in the push for rapid industrialization and agricultural reform. By 1957, the campaign had turned dramatically. The party initiated the anti-rightist campaign, targeting those who had spoken out. Hundreds of thousands of men and women, intellectuals, teachers, journalists, and bureaucrats were labeled rightists and subjected to public denunciation, forced labor, imprisonment, or worse. Many lost their jobs, homes, and social standing. Some were compelled to commit suicide under extreme pressure. The very movement that had been presented as an opportunity for free expression had become a tool of political repression, illustrating the delicate and often dangerous balance between openness and authoritarian control. This episode was a turning point for both Mao and the Communist Party. It exposed the limits of dissent under a tightly controlled political system and reinforced the leadership's belief that ideological unity was essential for China's transformation. The campaign also sent a chilling message. Criticism could be tolerated only to the extent that it did not threaten the party's authority or challenge the core of its socialist vision. The consequences of the 100 Flowers campaign extended beyond politics. Intellectual life in China was profoundly affected, with many scholars and professionals forced into conformity or silence. Universities became arenas of ideological indoctrination, and the free exchange of ideas was curtailed. Even cultural and artistic expression fell under scrutiny, as writers, playwrights, and artists learned to navigate a landscape where creativity was tolerated only if it aligned with party doctrine. Mao's personal calculations during this period were complex. The initial encouragement of debate reflected a genuine desire to gauge public opinion and identify flaws in governance. But the rapid escalation of criticism threatened to undermine the party's achievements and social stability. The campaign became a lesson in the dangers of overestimating the controllability of public discourse, a lesson that would shape the party's approach to governance in the years to come. In retrospect, the 100 Flowers campaign and its violent aftermath revealed the paradox at the heart of Mao's leadership, a visionary committed to transforming China's society and economy, yet fiercely intolerant of challenges to his authority. It demonstrated the immense power of ideological control and foreshadowed the even more ambitious and disastrous campaigns that would follow, where the tension between revolutionary zeal and practical reality would have catastrophic consequences for millions. By 1957, China had entered a period of intense political consolidation. The Communist Party, having tested the limits of tolerance and suppressed dissent, emerged stronger, more centralized, and more determined than ever to pursue its vision of a socialist utopia. Yet beneath the surface, the campaign left deep scars in the intellectual and cultural life of the nation, scars that would shape China as societal fabric for decades. By 1958, the successes of the first five-year plan had emboldened Mao Zedong. Industrial production had soared. Infrastructure had been built, and the Communist Party had consolidated its control over both cities and villages. Yet for Mao, these achievements were only the beginning. He envisioned a China that could leapfrog decades of development, transforming itself almost overnight into a modern socialist superpower. This vision crystallized into a bold, audacious initiative: the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was conceived as a nationwide campaign to accelerate industrialization and agricultural output simultaneously. Mao believed that collective effort, mass mobilization, and ideological fervor could achieve what conventional economic planning could not. Central to this plan was the reorganization of rural life. Existing agricultural cooperatives were merged into massive people's communes, encompassing dozens, sometimes hundreds of villages. Each commune would pool land, labor, and resources under party supervision, aiming to maximize efficiency and ensure that every citizen contributed to the socialist cause. The communes represented a radical social experiment. Individual households no longer controlled their land or harvests. Communal dining halls replaced private kitchens, symbolizing the suppression of individualism in favor of collective identity. Schools, medical services, and local governance were brought under the direct oversight of the commune, creating a network through which party ideology permeated every aspect of daily life. Mao envisioned a society in which work, production, and social life were harmonized toward the singular goal of national progress. Industrial ambition ran parallel to agricultural reforms. Propaganda campaigns urged citizens to build backyard furnaces and steel works, transforming villages into miniature industrial centers. Families and communities were called upon to produce steel in crude furnaces, often melting down cooking utensils, tools, and even gates to meet production targets. The party broadcasted slogans and stories celebrating ordinary people as industrial heroes, framing participation in these initiatives as both patriotic duty and personal honor. Initially, the Great Leap Forward generated a sense of optimism and unity. Villages competed to exceed production quotas, and local officials reported impressive harvests and steel output. However, the reality was far more complicated. Many backyard furnaces produced metal that was brittle and unusable, while exaggerated reports of grain production led authorities to requisition more food than villages could sustain. Poor planning, lack of technical expertise, and the suppression of dissent created a perilous environment in which mistakes could not be acknowledged or corrected. Environmental factors compounded the crisis. Droughts and floods struck regions already stretched thin by ambitious agricultural demands. Crop failures were common, but local officials, fearing punishment or loss of status, concealed the severity of the situation. Consequently, the central government believed that food supplies were abundant. Even as millions of rural inhabitants faced hunger and malnutrition, the combination of mismanagement, ideological pressure, and natural disaster would soon converge into a humanitarian catastrophe. Despite the mounting risks, the political climate left little room for moderation. Mao's authority was virtually unassailable. reinforced by decades of revolutionary struggle, ideological campaigns, and the loyalty of top leaders. Ambitious party cadres, eager to prove their commitment and advance their careers, often reported inflated figures, escalating expectations beyond what reality could support. Enthusiasm and fear intertwined, driving policies that were increasingly divorced from practical constraints. The Great Leap Forward was not merely an economic program, it was a test of Mao's vision for China. He believed that through mass mobilization, the country could achieve miracles. Steel could be produced everywhere, crops would flourish under collective effort, and China could leap ahead of nations that had taken centuries to industrialize. But the gap between aspiration and reality would prove catastrophic. By the end of 1958, the foundations for disaster were firmly laid. People's communes dominated the countryside, backyard furnaces dotted the villages, and propaganda proclaimed a new era of limitless potential. The seeds of tragedy, sown in overconfidence, ideology, and unrealistic goals, were hidden beneath the surface of apparent success. What had begun as a campaign of national pride and revolutionary zeal was about to spiral into one of the most devastating man-made famines in human history. By 1959, the optimism that had defined the early months of the Great Leap Forward began to fade, giving way to a grim reality. The people's communes, once hailed as the pinnacle of collective effort, now revealed serious flaws in both planning and execution. Crops withered in fields that were overworked or mismanaged, and the emphasis on industrial output, particularly the obsession with backyard steel production, diverted labor away from essential agricultural tasks. Villages were left vulnerable, and harvests fell far below expectations. Local officials, under intense pressure to meet targets, continued to report inflated production figures. In Beijing, these falsified reports convinced central authorities that China was producing a surplus of grain, prompting the government to requisition vast amounts of food for urban centers and export purposes. Meanwhile, rural families, stripped of their private plots and dependent on communal rations, faced dwindling supplies. The stage was set for a famine of unprecedented scale. Environmental misfortunes compounded the crisis. Droughts scorched fields in some provinces, while floods devastated others. Traditional knowledge and local agricultural practices were often ignored or suppressed in favor of party directives. And innovative methods that could have mitigated the disaster were dismissed as backward or ideologically suspect. The combination of natural calamities, mismanagement, and ideological rigidity produced a perfect storm. The human cost was staggering. Villagers endured hunger, malnutrition, and the relentless psychological toll of witnessing neighbors succumb to starvation. Reports of cannibalism, while harrowing, began to emerge in the most severely affected areas. Entire communes faced catastrophic losses. With families torn apart and generations decimated, scholars today estimate that the Great Leap Forward resulted in the deaths of at least 45 million people, making it one of the deadliest man-made famines in recorded history. Mao and the central leadership were slow to recognize the severity of the situation. Partly, this was a result of the flow of misinformation. Local officials feared reporting failure, while the political culture discouraged dissent. Partly, it was a reflection of ideological commitment. Acknowledging the disaster risked undermining the narrative of revolutionary progress and Mao's personal authority. The tension between image and reality created a tragic disconnect, where suffering unfolded largely invisible to those in power. Even within the party, there were murmurs of concern. At the Lushan Conference in 1959, Defense Minister Peng Dewa openly criticized the Great Leap Forward, describing the famine and the destructive policies of the communes. Mao reacted with fury. Peng was denounced, stripped of his positions, and placed under house arrest. His dissent, though grounded in facts and compassion, served as a warning. No one could challenge the party's direction without risking their life and career. The famine spread unevenly, but relentlessly. Provinces such as Anhui, Hunan, and Sichuan were hit hardest. Villagers endured starvation, forced labor, and public humiliation, while the party's propaganda continued to extol the supposed achievements of the Great Leap Forward. The dissonance between propaganda and lived reality created a climate of fear, secrecy, and despair. People were encouraged to report neighbors for hoarding food or showing counter-revolutionary tendencies, further eroding trust within communities. Meanwhile, ambitious industrial projects often failed spectacularly. Backyard furnaces produced useless pig iron. Massive irrigation and infrastructure schemes consumed enormous resources with little tangible benefit. The human toll of these failures, both from overwork and malnutrition, added to the growing catastrophe. For millions of rural Chinese, survival became the daily struggle, as hope for relief remained distant. By 1961, the party could no longer ignore the scale of the disaster. Adjustments were made, communes were downsized, private plots restored, and rationing revised. Yet the psychological and demographic scars of the famine endured. Families had been destroyed, villages depopulated, and intellectual life in rural areas severely disrupted. The Great Leap Forward, intended as a bold leap toward modernity and prosperity, had instead become a chapter of immense suffering, a testament to the dangers of ideology untempered by reality. The lessons of this period were seared into the collective memory of the nation. For Mao, it was a moment of political survival. He remained at the helm, but practical governance increasingly fell to pragmatic leaders such as Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, and Deng Xiaoping. Their interventions mitigated further disaster, restored some measure of stability, and laid the groundwork for the cautious recovery that would follow. By 1961, the devastating consequences of the Great Leap Forward could no longer be hidden. The famine had claimed millions of lives, and the economic chaos was becoming impossible to ignore. Even within the highest ranks of the Chinese Communist Party, murmurs of dissent began to surface. Leaders who had once unquestioningly followed Mao were now quietly advocating for pragmatism, calling for policy adjustments and a scaling back of the most radical experiments. Zhou Enlai, the consummate diplomat and administrator, emerged as a crucial figure during this period. His approach was measured and strategic. He sought to stabilize the country without directly challenging Mao's authority. Together with Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, Zhou implemented a series of corrective measures. Communes were partially dismantled, allowing some land and resources to return to individual households. Farmers regained limited autonomy to cultivate private plots, and the public kitchens that had replaced family-based meals were gradually scaled back. These early policy adjustments represented the first subtle pushback against Mao's unrestrained vision. They acknowledged the undeniable truth that the country's population could not survive on ideological zeal alone. Grain distribution was recalibrated to prevent further mass starvation, while agricultural techniques were revised to integrate traditional knowledge and local expertise. It was a recognition, however reluctant, that the top-down one-size-fits-all approach of the Great Leap Forward had failed. Yet, despite these adjustments, Mao's personal authority remained largely unchallenged. He retained his position as chairman of the Communist Party, and the political culture of fear and loyalty continued to suppress overt criticism. Those who opposed him openly, like Defense Minister Peng Dehuai at the Lushan Conference, had been purged or silenced. Resistance within the party had to navigate a delicate balance. It was about survival as much as governance. Leaders like Liu and Zhou became the stewards of quietly steering the country away from disaster, while maintaining the outward appearance of adherence to Mao's ideology. The rural population, too, began to adjust and resist in subtle ways. Villagers, faced with impossible production quotas and harsh living conditions, often found creative means to preserve food and resources for their families. These acts of quiet defiance, hoarding seed grain, selectively tending crops, or discreetly ignoring impractical directives, illustrated the limits of ideological control when confronted with the basic necessities of survival. Meanwhile, China's international posture was affected by these domestic upheavals. The early 1960s saw a growing tension with the Soviet Union. Mao, already wary of Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies and critiques of excessive authoritarianism, viewed the Soviet emphasis on technical expertise and centralized planning with suspicion. The famine, however, exposed the weaknesses of overzealous ideological campaigns, foreshadowing an eventual reassessment of China's approach to modernization and foreign relations. By the end of 1962, it was clear that the Great Leap Forward, while catastrophic in human terms, had also catalyzed the emergence of a pragmatic leadership within the party. Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping were increasingly entrusted with the day-to-day management of the country, gradually restoring stability to agriculture, industry, and governance. Mao, meanwhile, retreated somewhat from direct oversight, though he remained the symbolic and ideological center of power. These years also sowed the seeds for future political struggles. The tension between ideology and pragmatism, between loyalty to Mao and the need for practical governance, would shape the trajectory of China for decades to come. The early signs of resistance, quiet, cautious, and often invisible, were the first glimmers of a complex negotiation between authority, survival, and the realities of governing the world's most populous nation. By 1961, the scale of the Great Leap Forward's failures had become impossible to ignore. The famine had left a deep scar across the countryside, and the economic upheaval threatened to destabilize the very foundations of the Communist Party. For Mao, the charismatic architect of China's revolutionary vision, this was a moment of both political danger and strategic opportunity. He could not admit outright defeat without risking his authority, yet inaction would imperil the survival of the nation and the legitimacy of his leadership. The party began to implement a series of measured adjustments, guided largely by pragmatic leaders such as Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping. They prioritized immediate relief for the starving population. Grain requisitions were scaled back, private plots were restored, and communal kitchens were reduced in scope. Farmers were allowed to retain small portions of their harvests. providing a lifeline to millions of households that had been previously stripped of autonomy. These retreats were subtle but effective, reintroducing elements of traditional agricultural practice alongside modern techniques and limited local decision-making. In parallel, industrial ambitions were reined in. The disastrous backyard steel furnaces, once symbols of collective fervor and Maoist determination, were closed or repurposed, and labor previously diverted to unproductive industrial campaigns returned to farming. Infrastructure projects, some of which had consumed vast quantities of manpower and resources, were reassessed. The party realized that survival and productivity required a careful balance between ideological zeal and practical expertise. Mao's political position, while still dominant, had shifted. He remained the undisputed chairman of the Communist Party, the face of revolutionary legitimacy, and the symbolic heart of China's socialist experiment. However, the practical governance of the country increasingly fell to his capable lieutenants. Zhou Enlai's diplomatic skill, Liu Shaoqi's organizational acumen, and Deng Xiaoping's reformist pragmatism became the backbone of China's recovery efforts. Their quiet stewardship stabilized both the economy and society, allowing the party to regain some measure of credibility in the eyes of the population. The retreat and adjustments also revealed a growing awareness of the limits of ideological campaigns. Mao began to accept, at least tacitly, that sweeping, top-down programs could not be sustained without regard for local realities and human needs. The tension between revolutionary vision and practical governance became a defining feature of the party's internal dynamics. Leaders had to navigate this delicate balance carefully, protecting the authority of Mao while addressing the urgent needs of a country in crisis. Across rural China, survival became the guiding principle. Villagers employed subtle forms of resistance, hoarding seed grain, cultivating hidden plots, and selectively following directives to protect their families. These acts, though small and often hidden, underscored the resilience of the population and the limits of centralized control. The party, in turn, adapted its policies to accommodate these realities, blending coercion with pragmatism. Internationally, China's retreat highlighted the vulnerability of its ambitious ideological projects. Relations with the Soviet Union had already grown tense due to Mao's resistance to Khrushchev's de-Stalinization and calls for moderation. The famine further underscored the potential costs of ideological rigidity, even as China remained determined to assert itself as a sovereign and independent socialist power. By the end of 1962, the retreat from the most disastrous elements of the Great Leap Forward had begun to stabilize China. Agricultural production slowly recovered, famine-related mortality declined, and economic activity began to normalize. Yet the political and social ramifications lingered. The party had learned a painful lesson about the perils of overambition, and the balance between ideology and pragmatism would continue to shape China's path in the years ahead. This period of retreat and adjustment marked not only the end of the immediate crisis but also a crucial transition in Chinese politics. From revolutionary excess toward cautious, pragmatic governance, Mao remained the ultimate authority, but the day-to-day survival of the nation increasingly depended on the skill and judgment of his closest allies. In these tense years, the foundations for China's later modernization and the continuing tensions between vision and reality were quietly laid. Even as China struggled to recover from the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward, a new and more complex challenge emerged on the international stage: the widening rift with the Soviet Union. Once a trusted ally and model for socialist development, Moscow increasingly became a source of tension rather than support. Mao's vision of Chinese communism diverged sharply from Khrushchev's evolving policies, and the ideological, strategic, and personal differences between the two leaders intensified. The roots of the Sino-Soviet split stretched back to 1956, when Khrushchev's secret speech denounced Stalin's cult of personality and the excesses of the Soviet system. To Mao, the speech was a direct affront not only to the legacy of communism, but to the model of revolutionary leadership he himself embodied. He interpreted Khrushchev's criticism as a betrayal of Marxist-Leninist principles and a warning against bold, transformative leadership. Mao's commitment to his own radical vision of socialism made compromise increasingly impossible. By the late 1950s, differences extended far beyond ideology. The Soviets, emphasizing technical expertise and gradual industrial development, grew wary of Mao's mass mobilization campaigns and the disastrous policies of the Great Leap Forward. Moscow began withholding technical assistance, limiting support for key industrial and military programs. These actions were interpreted in Beijing as deliberate humiliation, further hardening Mao's resolve to pursue independent paths of development, free from Soviet oversight or influence. The rift had immediate political and military consequences. By 1960, the Soviet Union had withdrawn thousands of advisors and technical experts from China, leaving the country to navigate complex industrial and scientific programs on its own. Nuclear research, missile development, and industrial planning, once heavily reliant on Soviet guidance, now had to be managed domestically. China, isolated in its ambitions, embraced self-reliance, accelerating the cultivation of a uniquely Chinese model of modernization. The ideological battle was equally fierce. Mao launched campaigns emphasizing the primacy of revolutionary zeal over bureaucratic caution, framing the Soviet approach as revisionist and morally weak. Propaganda depicted China as the true standard-bearer of Marxist-Leninist thought, defending the revolutionary spirit against what Mao portrayed as Soviet compromise and softness. Chinese media, education, and party literature reinforced this narrative, fostering a sense of patriotic and ideological defiance among both officials and citizens. By 1964, the split was undeniable. China had successfully tested its first atomic bomb at Lap Nor, signaling both technological independence and military autonomy. It was a symbolic as well as practical declaration. China no longer needed to follow Soviet guidance to assert itself as a global power. The gap between Beijing and Moscow would only widen in the years to come, influencing not only foreign policy but also the trajectory of domestic politics. The Sino-Soviet split also left China in a precarious position internationally. With ideological allies increasingly distant and Western powers hostile, China faced isolation and potential threats on multiple fronts. Yet this period of estrangement also offered an opportunity. The party could define its own path, blending revolutionary ideology with pragmatic governance. Lessons learned from the recent crisis of the Great Leap Forward. The split set the stage for a China determined to prove its resilience both domestically and globally. It underscored the complex interplay between ideology, power, and survival, and it foreshadowed the radical campaigns and geopolitical assertiveness that would characterize the next phase of Mao's leadership. The message was clear. China would no longer be a satellite state following Soviet directives. It would be a solid actor on the world stage, willing to challenge both superpowers if necessary. Amid the political upheaval and economic turbulence of the post-Great Leap Forward era, China quietly pursued a path toward technological and scientific independence. The withdrawal of Soviet advisors in 1960 had left the country vulnerable in industrial, military, and nuclear arenas, but it also forced China to innovate and cultivate its own scientific capabilities. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and Beijing now faced a test that would define its role as a global power. The nation invested heavily in research institutions, universities, and technical schools, cultivating a generation of engineers, physicists, and chemists capable of advancing the country's strategic goals. In 1958, the Chinese Academy of Sciences expanded its programs, fostering expertise in nuclear physics, metallurgy, and missile technology. The emphasis was not only on practical results but also on cultivating a sense of national pride. Scientific achievement became a demonstration of China's self-reliance and revolutionary spirit. By 1964, China had achieved a milestone that would resonate far beyond its borders: the successful detonation of its first atomic bomb at Lap Nor in Xinjiang. The test, conducted in the remote deserts of western China, marked the nation's entry into the exclusive club of nuclear powers, joining the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. For Mao and the party, it was both a political and symbolic victory, a validation of China's capacity to stand independently in a world dominated by superpowers. 2 years later, China went further, testing its first hydrogen bomb. The rapid development of thermonuclear capability underscored a remarkable combination of political will, human ingenuity, and industrial determination. Despite the absence of foreign expertise, Chinese scientists and engineers pushed forward, often working under harsh conditions, extreme secrecy, and immense pressure to succeed. These successes also sent a clear message internationally. China could defend its sovereignty and assert its position without reliance on either the Soviet Union or the United States. Scientific advancement extended beyond nuclear weapons. China prioritized aerospace, missile technology, and industrial innovation, laying the groundwork for a modern military-industrial complex. Universities trained specialists in metallurgy, aeronautics, and electronics, while experimental factories and research institutes turned abstract theories into tangible outputs. Even the lessons learned from earlier policy disasters informed the approach. Experimentation was encouraged, but failures were contained and managed more systematically. This era also saw the emergence of domestic technological pride. Chinese leaders promoted the narrative that self-reliance in science and industry was not only a practical necessity but a moral imperative, a measure of revolutionary integrity. Propaganda celebrated scientists as heroes of the socialist state, paralleling the glorification once reserved for military or party leaders. Students and researchers were mobilized with the same fervor that had once driven mass industrial and agricultural campaigns, reflecting a shift from coercive labor to intellectual commitment. By 1964, China had transformed from a country dependent on Soviet technology to a nation capable of independent innovation. The successful nuclear tests were more than military milestones, they were declarations of ideological and political sovereignty. They solidified China's image as a formidable, self-reliant power and demonstrated that even in the aftermath of catastrophe, the nation could rise again with discipline, vision, and relentless determination. Mao and the Communist Party had learned the hard lessons of the past decade, while revolutionary zeal had led to famine and societal upheaval. A strategic pivot toward scientific and technological self-sufficiency offered a pathway to national strength and global recognition. The Great Leap Forward had failed, but the foundation for China's emergence as a modern power was quietly being built one experiment, one test, and one innovation at a time. By the mid-1960s, China had emerged from the shadows of internal catastrophe and international isolation to stake its claim as a rising power on the world stage. The Great Leap Forward had inflicted immense suffering, and the scars of famine and economic dislocation were still etched across the countryside. Yet, amidst this turbulence, the Communist Party had learned hard lessons about governance, social control, and the delicate balance between ambition and reality. Mao Zedong, while diminished in direct administrative authority, remained the symbolic and ideological core of the nation. His vision of a socialist China autonomous, unified, and unyielding continued to shape the party's direction. Pragmatic leaders such as Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, and Deng Xiaoping now managed the day-to-day affairs of governance, implementing policies to stabilize agriculture, revive industry, and restore confidence among the population. Collective decision-making complemented Mao's enduring ideological influence, creating a dual system where charisma and pragmatism coexisted uneasily but effectively. Agricultural policies were adjusted to prevent another humanitarian disaster. The scale of communes was reduced, private plots returned, and rationing systems recalibrated to meet basic needs. At the same time, the party retained strict control over production and distribution, ensuring that ideological goals continued to guide economic management. Education, healthcare, and infrastructure were prioritized, reflecting a broader commitment to state-directed social development. Internationally, China asserted itself with renewed confidence. The successful nuclear and technological programs demonstrated that the nation could operate independently of both the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc. Diplomatic initiatives, carefully measured military actions, and a growing sense of national pride allowed China to project influence beyond its borders. The seeds of modern Chinese diplomacy, combining firmness with strategic calculation, were being sown. Perhaps most importantly, the people of China were slowly adjusting to a new social reality. The revolutionary upheavals of the previous decade had reshaped class structures, gender roles, and community organization. The party's vision of collective identity, reinforced through propaganda, education, and public participation, sought to bind the nation together in a common cause. While resistance and resentment lingered, the narrative of national rejuvenation offered hope that the sacrifices of recent years might yet yield a stronger, unified China. In hindsight, this period of transition, painful, chaotic, but transformative, laid the groundwork for the China that would eventually assert itself as a global power. The failures of the Great Leap Forward were neither forgotten nor ignored. They became cautionary tales guiding future policy. At the same time, the successes in industrialization, scientific achievement, and military autonomy offered a blueprint for resilience and ambition. By 1965, China was no longer merely a nation recovering from revolution. It was a state asserting its independence, experimenting with modernization, and positioning itself as a distinct actor in a world dominated by superpowers. The lessons of these years of ideological zeal, tempered by pragmatism, of ambition constrained by reality, and of sovereignty defended through self-reliance, would resonate for decades to come. China's transformation was not complete, nor was it linear. Yet, even in the aftermath of human suffering and political upheaval, the nation had emerged with a renewed sense of purpose, capability, and identity. The stage was set for the next chapter, a China determined to define its destiny, both for its people and in the eyes of the world.